Good afternoon and welcome back to Early Modern Europe. This is lecture 3 in the term, and what we want to focus on today, and obviously it's pretty easily spelled out right here, it's the beginning of the European Renaissance. And really only going to be talking about the beginning of the Renaissance and not the entire Renaissance for a very simple reason. The beginning of the Renaissance sets the scene for everything that comes after it, including what happens into what we call the early modern age. And what's really important for us in setting the scene in this way is the recognition that the Renaissance era really is the end of the medieval period and then the transition into what we call the early modern period. And so what we need to do today is to look at a number of the realities of the Renaissance, what it means, where it came from, and its kind of lingering effects into the period that we're studying, the early modern period. Now, it's really important. You're thinking, well, why did we start then with the age of exploration or exploitation, depending on how you want to define those terms? Isn't this going a step backwards? Actually, it's concurrent. One of the interesting things about this period is all the stuff that is going on essentially at once. And this is why we look at this particular period of time as such a moment of transition. But make no mistake, right? We still have to understand that this is in continuity with the medieval period. It is only the scholars of this period, the intellectuals of the late 1300s and into the 1400s, that really start to acknowledge that they believe themselves to be in a different time, right? And that's really important. This is a self-realization. This is an understanding. It's not something that exists outside of their interpretation of the events and their perspective on those events. There is no signpost that exists in a certain year in the 14th century that says the Renaissance starts here. It is a sense of perspective. And the reason that that perspective develops is because these intellectuals look at their own period of time and they look at the previous centuries and say, aha, those people were backward and ignorant because ... And we'll get to that as we go along. And they're going to point to themselves as saying, aha, they were these backwards focused, backwards living kind of people. They were shrouded in periods of ignorance and darkness. This is where we first start to hear the term the Dark Ages. Here's a hint. Dark Ages never existed. It's always a perspective that is seen in hindsight. They didn't believe themselves to be living in the Dark Ages, and frankly, they didn't. It's a matter of perspective. All right, that all said, the people, these intellectuals living in the late 1300s and the early 1400s, saw themselves as living in the modern times, right? Well, so does everybody else. Everybody feels they live in the modern times because they do. Because modern, if we really want to be very specific about its definition, is relating to the current time, right? Which means that everybody lives in modern times because it relates to the current time. That's the only time that you live, is in the current moment. And so they weren't saying anything that was radically different than anybody else. The question is, why did they differentiate themselves and those backward centuries that had preceded them? Well, they are going to say that it's because they have this appreciation for antiquity, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. I know just enough about history to recognize that that wasn't really all that significantly different than, well, the entire Middle Ages. Frankly, it's true about Europeans since the time of the dissolution of the western half of the Roman Empire. The moment Rome falls, which it doesn't really, it more like slowly craters or dissolves or slowly chunks apart, right? Ever since that moment, the people looked back to the glory that was Rome. They've always admired the classical age of the Roman Empire and the Greeks before them. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, scholasticism, the movement in the Middle Ages that was put together by folks within the church that were trying to marry faith and reason, the reason that they were so excited about the possibility of being able to do that is because they were reading Aristotle, which is about as big of a classical era author as you're going to be able to find. And frankly, even in the early part of the 1300s, somebody who I would say is, if not early Renaissance, right, definitely proto-Renaissance, is a guy named Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy. And in that 3-volume work, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, right, hell, purgatory, and heaven, it's a wall-to-wall mix of Christian and classical tropes and mythologies with literary and historical characters stretching all the way back as far as you could possibly want to get in the classical era. I mean, honestly, Virgil, the Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, is Dante's guide through at least the Inferno and Purgatorio. They knew about the ancient world. They knew about classical Greece and the Roman Empire. And so the question is, what changed? What was the difference? Well, what we're going to see today is that there's social, economic, political, and religious developments in the 14th century and into the 15th century that's going to create an environment for growth in new directions, an environment for innovation across the board. So today, I want to focus on 3 main areas when looking at the beginning of the European Renaissance. The first is that the European Renaissance is going to emerge as one of the after effects of the Black Plague. The second is we're going to be talking about the rise of capitalism. And yes, even though they didn't call it capitalism, what they were doing at this period of time is definitely nascent capitalism, right? I'm sure that you've said, well, wait a minute, what about Adam Smith and all that? That's just finally when they put a term to it. But make no mistake, and I'll describe it, capitalism is there, and that's what helps boost what we would call the Renaissance. And also a bit of combination of materialism and humanism. And there's your recipe. There's your recipe for what we will call the Renaissance, this rebirth. We haven't come up with a better word for it. This works as well as anything. But make no mistake, It is imperative that we do not see this as a radical break from the medieval past. It is not. It is a radical or a desire for a radical break with the medieval past by the intellectuals who are going to describe this new day. But that does not mean that that is actually true. It is a matter of perception and perspective. This is what they want it to be, as opposed to what it actually is. But the other half of that is, it is a dramatic shift and an important shift for the development of Western civilization. No doubt about it. No getting around it. I am not going to say that this isn't a big thing. It is. But we need to put that big thing into context and into continuity with what came before it. Because by doing that, we start to see that human history is not put into neat and tidy Aristotelian categories or periodizations. There is an ebb and flow to human history that defies periodization. We only put things into specific periods because it's easier then to take a look at it. The problem is that when we put things into those periods, we have a tendency as human beings to say, aha, there must have been a clean beginning and a clean ending. And there isn't, right? There's continuity and discontinuity. And we need to be able to recognize how that works and that it exists. That informs our understanding of history as well as anything, because it gives us a certain sense of healthy caution against making too broad of statements or too declarative of statements. Human history is so much more fascinating when we allow it its nuances. And in the end, we learn more about it. Because human history is just as complex as, well, us, humans. We're the ones who make up the story. We're the ones who develop the story and write the story. It's not going to be less complex than us. But the good thing about it, though, is that we can figure it out. It's not a mystery. It's just a matter of tracking down sources and asking good questions. So that's where we're going to start. And we're going to start then with, well, of all things, the Black Plague, right? And you're thinking, yay, I'm so excited about this. The reason we start with the Black Plague is really very simple. This was one of the most dislocating, disruptive events in Western European history. It is spectacular. Is it the first major plague to hit the European continent? Nope, not even close. We are, throughout all of human history, constantly dealing with plague outbreaks, pandemics of certain scope and size throughout all of human history. You can, in fact, do a lovely history of the human story through plague outbreaks, pandemics, epidemics. There are a number of really quality books written on that very subject with that very theme. And that we are living through another one is testament to the fact that they have deep and profound effects in the short term and in the long term on human civilization and human societies. So it should not come at all as a surprise to us that the Black Plague, starting in 1348, lasting to 1352, in its first outbreak, right? We'll get smaller outbreaks for the next couple of hundred years. But the big one, right? The big one is 1348 to 1352, and it is going to have cataclysmic effects and impacts on European society. And so we begin, in many ways, right at the very top line of the whole story, that the first thing that we recognize is that it is going to wipe out 30 to 50% of the European population in just a few short years. Just like that. And people are going to die spectacularly, gruesomely, and they don't know where it's coming from. They don't know about the germ theory of disease. They do not know that it's the fleas on the rats and other animals that are transmitting this. They just know that people are dying in gruesome fashion and that it is wiping the population out. It is appalling. It is astounding. And it is rupturing in European society. Just for example, in Germany alone, over 400,000 villages will just disappear. Right? Just gone. Think of the toll this is going to have on human society. Think of the psychological and spiritual toll it's going to take. This image, the dance of the macabre, is going to be prevalent throughout the decades after, as there is a heightened focus on death and dying, on the body and the corruption of the body. People are going to focus on this, and it makes sense because all of a sudden, people who are not unused to death, right? Everybody dies at home, generally. And so people are used to dead bodies. They are not used to dead bodies that look like this, right? Open sores, oozing pus everywhere. They call it the Black Plague because it darkens the skin where the buboes first emerge, usually in the armpits and the groin, and then spreading throughout. It's painful. It's disgusting. And so people are going to see and focus on the very physicality of the way in which the body essentially is corrupted and destroyed in this. It's not great. And so images like this, right, are all over the place, ubiquitous almost. And this focus then on death and decay is going to be something that a lot of people are going to be just hanging on to, right? And so that, think of the psychological toll of a disease like this, that you don't know where it came from, why it's happening, how it's spreading, or who is even going to die from it. Some people don't, right? Some people actually get it and then don't die. Some people aren't touched at all. Think of what that does to the society. Think of what that does to the psychological component of everybody involved. And then think also of the spiritual component. What's really interesting is that religious faith didn't actually shrink after this. A lot of people were absolutely convinced that this was condemnation and punishment by God for sins they weren't even sure what. Somebody was to blame for this. Of course, unfortunately, far too many Christians blamed the Jews for this. It was their fault. Absolutely not. That's another anti-Judaic trope that emerges from this period of time. It just adds to the constant refrain of anti-Judaism during the Middle Ages. It wasn't their fault, right? We know that. But people were looking for somebody to blame. And so they thought maybe that God was punishing them for something. What we're going to get out of all of this, though, is actually a religious revival. Religious devotion and religious expression is going to deepen. It's going to be even more flamboyant, right? This is where we do get all sorts of very interesting and highly dodgy religious groups that are going to emerge, like the flagellants, right? That they will walk through towns beating themselves in a display of repentance for the sins of the world. It's very extreme, but it doesn't dwindle. And so the psychological and the social or in the religious aspects are profound, and they're going to linger for decades. And a part of that is going to be a religious awakening to the idea that maybe they shouldn't be focused just on the religious impact of their faith in the afterlife, but right now, right? It kind of sharpens the focus rather a lot. It's a fascinating thing, what's going on, right? And so what we see is that the Black Plague is really setting a new standard for social awareness, psychological awareness, and religious expression. But it's not just that. It's not just that. And in fact, there are a number of other things that are going on that leads me to ask a really weird question. Was Thanos right? Right? I'm assuming that by this point, everybody has seen Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame. And if you haven't, you've been living under a pop culture rock, right? Because even your professor has seen these things, right? And my goodness, look at how old he looks. In the movies, right, Thanos theorized that if he snaps away half the population, that for those who survive, things will get better, right? I'm not going to go through the whole exposition. If you want it, go find this scene. It's a great speech. It's chilling, but it's a great speech. And he wasn't fully wrong, which is why the writers wrote this. Somebody had to have paid attention to what was going on after the Black Plague. You're thinking, this is really grim, Dr. Grant. Are you suggesting that this was a good idea? Are you on Thanos' side? No, I'm just saying that from a particular perspective, you could say that he wasn't wrong, at least in the near term. The interesting thing about human beings is that we repopulate pretty easily. Even after the Black Plague, it wasn't going to be but a few generations before our populations were getting back to normal. But that's a different story. But it does lead me to say a few things. If you depopulate that radically, you are going to have a relative abundance of food and other material resources, right? You're just going to have more food because there are fewer mouths to feed. The price of grain is going to fall. It's going to make all grain products more affordable. The scarcity of workers, right? Because now all of a sudden there are fewer people doing those jobs, made peasant labor more valuable, which means if there's more value in each individual peasant, their wages, which may not have existed before this, they're now going to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, that farm is not going to get worked if not for me. So here you go. Pay up, man. And those who did get wages, their value is going to increase. Now, the landowners and the aristocracy are not always going to be, wait a minute, why would we have to pay for labor? We've never paid for labor before. We gave you that little half acre of land. Isn't that sufficient? And they're like, no, it's not. Not a chance. Right? Which is going to lead to uprisings. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But nonetheless, your value as a laborer has just gone up. So food's more plentiful. Your value is higher. Ordinary folks could now afford more than just bread, which they can now afford even easier. And so if the price of bread has gone down, that means they've got a little surplus. And with that surplus, they can spend money on, well, dairy products, meat, fish, fruit, wine. As a result, the people of Europe after this are going to be better nourished than they had ever been. I mean, frankly, their nourishment in the generation or two after the Black Plague is sometimes better than many people today. And you're thinking, wait, how do you know this? Well, historians, clever as they can be, material culture historians went through a histories of 15th century garbage dumps, rubbish dumps in Glasgow, Scotland. And what they discovered is that the people of Glasgow in the early 15th century had a better diet than the people of Glasgow did in 2005. It had more variety. It was better in that it was staple grains and clean proteins and all the rest, fruit, wine, you name it, right? Their diet was better, which meant that they were healthier. They lived longer. They didn't have as many diseases because their diet was improved. That led to population growth. All right, so it wasn't just the people. The land showed a similar change. Land that had been over-farmed for centuries, much of it is now laying fallow, meaning it's not producing crop, but it's rejuvenating. It's getting necessary nutrients, minerals back into the soil, right? Which meant that when they did farm fields, their yields were better. There's a declining demand for grain meant that farmers could now expand their livestock herds. There was more room for livestock, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, you name it. And this, if you're pasturing livestock, that's going to improve the fertility of the soil through, well, manure. Cow crap and all the rest is really good for the soil. It introduces all those nutrients and minerals back into the soil. It's good. And so livestock herds are going to help improve the soil. Forests, which had almost completely disappeared in Europe because the only source of fuel was wood, and likewise, most people built their homes out of wood, most of the forests were gone. And so, forests are going to start to regrow. Just a couple generations, forested areas in Europe are going to increase by 1/3. Right? The economy is going to improve. Food supplies are going to improve. The diet improves. The labor market and value improves. the ecological damage done by European society is going to be undone. Fewer people, fewer mouths to feed, fewer strain and stress on the world. Right? I mean, we hate to say it, but you got to take these things into consideration. But what this also means, which is absolutely imperative, is that we are going to see that this is going to have a dramatic impact on society. It's interesting too, because the other thing that we're going to see throughout the late 1400 or 14th century especially are peasant revolts, right? All of a sudden people are going to say, wait a minute, we don't have to keep doing the things the way that we've been doing. We've got more power now because we have more leverage now. If you want to get things done, you're going to need to work with us. The first one, right? Is the Jacquerie Rebellion. (1358), right? I mean, the Black Plague has barely even receded by this point, and this is going to be in northwest France. Peasants are going to rise up in rebellion against the aristocracy and the landowners, right? And they're going to do it because they're tired of not being compensated for the work that they do. They demand greater say, better wages, better living conditions. And to get their point across, they're going to destroy property, they're going to burn buildings and crops, and they're going to kill certain members of the aristocracy. Protest, right, is the language of the powerless. They're going to take this into their own hands and see if they can't get some changes made in a society that they know has changed. They know that their value has improved, and they want their life to improve because of it. We see another one. The Ciompi Revolt, 1378 to 1382. This is in Florence. The Ciompi are the cloth industry workers. That's how that translates. They protested high unemployment. You're thinking, you need us to make this, and yet they kept employment artificially high as a way of trying to control the workers. They also protested mistreatment by the guilds and the manufacturers, the ones who ran the city government. And at one point, the Ciompi are going to actually seize control of the government, and they will maintain control of the city for 6 weeks, which is no mean feat at this point in time. And then the last one, and of course, these are three that are just reflective of broader societal trends and many smaller revolts and rebellions. These are just some of the biggest ones, the ones that are most well known, right? The Peasants' Revolt, in England in 1381. These are peasants and essentially what we would call day laborers, and they're following the reformer John Wycliffe. a priest who had been making a lot of noise about making reforms in the church. He had called for the redistribution of church property, meaning let's sell off a lot of these church holdings and give that money to the poor, which is something that he found in this really obscure little text called the Bible. He argued that people should be able to read the Bible in their own language. He questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation. And so people were saying, well, if the guys in the church are starting to ask these questions and saying that life should be, or that society should be more equitable, then let's carry on. And they were really fired up by another cleric, and this guy was a radical, a guy named John Ball, who wasn't really lockstep with John Wycliffe, but was more of a social rabble-rouser who was advocating for a greater sense of equity for everybody in society. And they got themselves ramped up into a pure out-and-out revolt, and England had a heck of a time putting this one back down. Now, it is true that all of these revolts are ultimately unsuccessful. But boy, did they mark a huge and significant break with the past. Because all of a sudden, the unwashed masses, what the Greeks would call the hoi polloi, right? The common herd. All of a sudden, they realized that not only could they organize, but they could almost legitimately challenge the existing authority because things were different. And while these individual rebellions would fail, the ideas would linger, and the impulse behind them would not fade. And in fact, it's going to push social and political changes over time, all because they found themselves in a new situation, at least in Western Europe. And that's really important. And that social, political, and economic new day is vital in our understanding of this time of transition. And there's no doubt about it, right? Peasants were starting to realize that things didn't have to remain the same. And that idea was filtering throughout all segments of the European population. There were people now in positions of authority and positions of power who recognized that things were changing. The question was, where were we going to see the first major move? And of course, as with all human societies, what is going to motivate and push social change is how it affects us personally. And that comes down to economy, or our personal economies. Essentially, how do we take care of our household? That's what economy means, right? Managing and taking care of our households. Economia is what it is in the Greek, right? And that's where we make our next turn then, right? Because this is going to be one of the most important components of where we go next. Because while the intellectuals and the scholars are going to be pushing and exploring, it's the way the world functions socially and economically, and therefore politically, that's going to make the major changes happen. Because as we see, as a result of the Black Plague, What we are now seeing is resurgent economic growth in towns and cities, which are going to create vast new streams of wealth and opportunity. Capitalism grows out of this fertile environment. All right, a basic primer on capitalism and business, frankly, will help us a great deal at this particular time. All businesses require capital to either begin or maintain. And the most rudimentary form of capital is money, cash, gold, silver, whatever it is that we have deemed precious and said, aha, that's worth something, right? Because all coinage, right, and all the rest, any money that we use is something that we have said has inherent value, right? It's all fiat currency. We all say that has value as opposed to that, right? Even gold in and of itself only has value because we find it valuable, right? Pretty simple. All right, so if you want to start a business, now, in years past, you had to be born into somebody who was in a family that had wealth because they had land. For most of human history, land has equaled wealth. And that's still true, right? We still know this to be true even today. It's why we always encourage people to own their own home. And in fact, one of the best ways to pass wealth on from one generation to the next is home ownership, right? This house that we live in right now, if we lived here long enough to pay off the mortgage, we would then give that to our kids, to our family, and they would have a nest egg of developed wealth, right? That's why home ownership is so important, especially even still in the modern age. All right, but say if you wanted to start a business, you wanted to do something, you wanted to make something, right? You need cash to get started, or you need collateral. You need something that has value. You need capital of some variety. All right. So let's say you have some cash or some collateral and you get your loans and you start your business. Congratulations. You need that capital to begin or maintain that business. Now, one form of capital, now that you've got your business going, is, well, profit. And you're thinking, wait a minute, Dr. Grant, did we wander into an economics class all of a sudden? And remember, I've always said history is the most interdisciplinary area of study on a college campus. We touch all the bases, every last one of them, right? Everybody in this class, whatever your major is, whatever you've ever studied, will hit on it at some point in time. That's just the way it works. So, one form of that capital is your profit. This is the wealth that's left over after your expenses are fully paid. At the end of the day, that's the stuff that is just free and clear. That's wealth that you have earned through your work, and it's left over. All your business expenses are paid and you're good to go. Capitalism derives from a really basic practice. You take that capital, your profit, that's left over, and instead of spending it, and this is the most important thing, instead of spending that capital, your profits, on any number of things, right? Could be luxury items, could be travel, it could be good food, it could be whatever, right? In capitalism, you take that leftover capital And instead of spending it, you invest it back into your business. That's it. That's capitalism, at least in its most rudimentary form. You can reinvest in ongoing operations, right? You can expand what you're doing, or you could even help start another business. And you could either start one of your own businesses, or, and this is the fun part of capitalism, you could help somebody else start a business. And now that you have invested in somebody else, you're a stakeholder in that business, which means that since you helped them to get started, you can develop a contract for a percentage of their profits, right? You got them going, you got them started, and so you get a cut of their bottom line, of their profits. So you are using capital to continue the cycle. Therefore, capitalism. It's not that complicated, right? And it's not something that is going to wait until a few hundred years down the road when they actually identify that that's what this is, when they coined the word capitalism. It starts here. So these investments are going to lead to greater profits, right? It's an engine for economic growth and progress, and it leads to growing wealth, right? Now, one of the other things that's really important about capitalism is that capitalism, because you're constantly reinvesting, you're constantly finding new streams to build your wealth, it really encourages innovation. Everyone is always looking for the next new thing. And the other thing that it's going to lead to is marketing, right? Because you have to convince people that they actually need the next new thing. There's modern advertising in a nutshell. Convincing you to part with your hard-earned capital on their products. See how this works? It's fascinating stuff. It really is. Now, again, at the time, they did not use the word capitalism. If you look in the 15th century documents, you're not going to find the word capitalism. It's coined by historians and economists much later, but make no mistake, that's what they were doing. Now, here's the interesting thing. Likely as not, this is not a purely European innovation, right? Other civilizations had been working along these same kinds of systems for a while, especially the large trading civilizations of India and parts of China and probably throughout the Muslim world, right? Now, I do want to make a clarification, though, that there's a difference between capitalism and free markets. They're not exactly the same thing, right? They shouldn't be seen as the same thing. Capitalism does require markets, right? And I don't care if they're real or virtual. It could be a grocery store or a website. It could be a service, right? Or it could be a place where product is actually sold. So capitalism requires markets, right? But the idea of any market being free, right? Meaning free from any restrictions imposed by any authority, it doesn't exist. And so even now, when we talk about free market economies, that's all markets have rules and all markets have costs, regardless, right? You may want to argue about how many regulations are good for markets, but all markets have some regulation. Even the people who are saying, I want a purely free market, they really don't. That's really not what they're looking for. What they're saying is that they want a market that is regulated in a way that benefits them, right? Okay, that's just a small digression, but it's really kind of an important thing. All right, so the strength of this new capitalist system is going to drive the old economic system into obsolescence. Because the old system in the medieval Europe was based on guilds, right? They were very structured, they were very hierarchical, they were very controlled, they were very regulated, right? Only certain people could get into a particular guild. And then you had to work your way up and work your way up. It's the whole system of apprenticeship and becoming a master, right? You start at the bottom rung, and only if you are in the right, field. And so it could be woodworking or leatherworking or goldsmithing or you name it, right? There was a guild for everything, and they were very tightly controlled. And because they were very tightly controlled and heavily regulated, they did not innovate particularly well. But it was the system that had developed during the Middle Ages. Capitalism is going to push this out. It's going to ease it into obsolescence because people are going to see that innovation leads to greater wealth generation. And so capitalism takes over fairly effectively because people could see the benefits to that kind of movement of capital and the innovation that it brought. So we get this rapid expansion of capital, right? And there is one new industry that is going to emerge that is very specifically suited to this new economic and social and political reality. And that's called banking. And you're thinking, but haven't people used, I don't know, for lack of a better term, banks before? Well, they've used money changers and money lenders. But in Christian society, especially in Christian Western Europe, they frowned on banking that did something very specific. And they would call that that practice that they did not want people to actually do, usury. What that means is lending money at interest. And you're thinking, well, wait, what in the world is wrong with lending money at interest? Well, really very simply stated, the scriptures, the Christian scriptures seem to say that if you lend money at interest, that money that is added onto it, hasn't been earned through work, right? That it feels a little bit like theft because you haven't actually earned that money. And so Christians tended to find the whole business of lending money at interest to be unsavory, which is why throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, it still took place, but the Christians didn't participate in it. It still needed to happen, but at a kind of a lower level. And so the Christians said, well, the Jews don't have a problem with usury, right? We'll let them do it. And so they essentially forced Jewish populations into kind of proto-early banking, and then turned right around and were furious because the Jews were able to, actually do this one form of industry that the society needed. And then the Christians then blamed them for being money hungry, right? I mean, honestly, it's like, you can only do this one thing. Okay, they've done it and they've done, a good job at it. Why are you doing that thing? You're horrible people. This is the, some of the deeper roots of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that grows throughout the Christian populations in Western Europe. It's ghastly, right? And that's where the tropes of Jews and money are still alive today, and they were founded in the Middle Ages on a situation that the Jewish population did not control, were forced into essentially at least finding some way to participate in the economy of the Middle Ages, and then got blamed for it because they were, had the temerity of actually being successful at it. So those are all stereotypes, they're all tropes, and they're all just absolutely dead wrong, right? It's just another one of those things. There's no grand conspiracy. It does not exist, right? That's all a fiction made up by resentful Christians. Really, I mean, that's the simple and the straightforward truth about that. All right. Okay, well, anyway, at this particular period of time, the Christians are going to get themselves around the whole problem with usury by saying, wait a minute, if we actually, right, if both parties benefit, then it's not usury. So if the borrower benefits because their money is now held safely in a bank, and I'll talk about this in just a second, then they're actually gaining from that. And then the lender is also benefiting because they're actually getting that small percentage. So they were able to rationalize around the whole usury problem by saying, well, hey, both sides are benefiting, so it's not actually theft. So it's okay, it's good. We're all good. This is awesome, right? Where needs must, we can rationalize a lot of things. And they did. They rationalized themselves right around it, right? Made that problem disappear just like that. It's amazing what we can do when we're motivated. All right, so banks, we're going to evolve from that mere money changers and even money lenders into places, literal places, that housed, secured, and allow money to be protected and then draw interest. So the growing system of banks allows money to move more easily around Europe. Banks are going to spring up in every major city, which means this is going to be so much easier to move from place to place and then to move your money from place to place. It's infinitely safer to have banks than to lug your capital around with you. Because if you keep taking your capital with you, well, it can be stolen because it's right there. And so if it's in a place, or if you have a note that says, right, and they have all of the bookkeeping to show that you have this X amount in your account, right? So much safer, so much easier, right? And again, this is probably an idea that was borrowed from Muslim trading partners, especially the kind of things that they called bills of exchange. If I write out a note that says, please give me X amount of dollars, right? And one bank gives that, allows you to sign that, and you take it to another place and you can draw that money out. It's called checking, right? Checking. I mean, that's all of what it is that you can access your account through pieces of paper in different places. So what you have now are banks set up, now emerging throughout Europe. And this is particularly important. It gives access to that capital in different places. It is safely and securely stored and protected. And it gives people the opportunity to be more mobile in their business practices and in the way in which they spend that capital. So, with all of this new wealth being generated by this new economic system, with all of this wealth being generated, two things are going to happen. First, the wealth is going to be distributed unevenly. If you had capital to start, you could get right into the game. And starting with something is definitely easier than starting with nothing. And so after a while, some families are going to be simply running out of things to invest their capital into. After a while, their businesses were so strong and so secure that they literally ran out of things to spend money on in reinvesting into their own companies or in other businesses, right? Would that we would have that kind of problem, right? I've run out of ways to essentially reinvest my capital into my own business. And so, with this kind of uneven distribution, there's a lot of excess wealth that is needing an outlet. And that leads to materialism, right? These wealthy families are like, I don't know what to spend my money on. I've got gobs of cash sitting in bank accounts all across Europe. I don't know what to spend it on. And so how do you make sure that everybody knows just how well you've done? You spend it on stuff, right? After you've essentially created your business and it's humming along, you start to buy things. And at first, this is going to be, another new home in the country, another new castle, right? All the best clothes, all that kind of finery, good food, exotic luxury goods from far away. And so you start to get fascinating knickknacks from every corner of the world that you can get your traders to. But after a while, even that's not sufficient to really show how successful you've been. And then something starts to get into the minds of the people, and that is what has always gotten in the minds of the people, and that's a legacy. And this is where we start to come back around on the notion that they're looking back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Those things, that stuff, art, architecture, literature, all of that, that's lasted for centuries, millennia. Think of the legacy. And so they start to say, how can we cement our legacy for all time? We've got the cash. We've got the ability to do something with it. So let's marry that with what's going on in the intellectual world at this time, right? Because what's going on in the intellectual world at this time is, well, folks like Petrarch, right? Who made a fascinating discovery. Petrarch, from Florence, may be one of the people that we might want to peg as the beginning of the literary and artistic Renaissance. A number of historians have said, yeah, we could probably go with Petrarch. That's a pretty good choice. I would move it back just a little bit farther and go with Dante Alighieri, but that's just me, right? Petrarch is often given this nod because he was doing some explorations when he was in Avignon, France. In the middle of the 14th century, the papacy had moved to Avignon. It wasn't at Rome anymore. And so the whole papal court is in Avignon, including all of their library collection and their archives. And so he is rummaging through the library at the papal court in Avignon, and he stumbled upon a manuscript of Cicero's letters, the great Roman orator, right? He stumbles upon Cicero's letters, and it seemed to be a manuscript that nobody seemed to have remembered for centuries, didn't even know it existed. It was just moldering away down there in the bowels of this library. And Petrarch, being a little bit high on his own image, said, "Aha! See, this just proves that I'm living in an age of ignorance. This great work has been forgotten for centuries and nobody has found it except me. I alone have seen the importance and the significance of this great collection." And it started a fascinating new wave of other scholars digging around in the monastic libraries and cathedral libraries throughout Europe, right? And what they did while they were digging through all these libraries of all these great houses of the monastic movement were other treasures of the past. They found countless manuscripts, right? And what was interesting is that they found not just one copy of a particular author, they found multiple copies. And then this got them really thinking. Well, if there are multiple copies and they started looking at them, there were differences. And so this got them going, this that, okay, if there is differences between this edition and this edition, which one is closer to the actual? And so they had a cry that they essentially developed, ad fontes. It's in Latin. It's back to the sources. And this is going to develop a new skill that's called textual criticism. Textual criticism is you compare the versions of these authors' writings in order to find the most accurate text, right? They wanted to go back as far. And what they realized is that, well, some of these are written in languages that they didn't know, specifically ancient Greek. The Latin, they could figure out. They realized that Latin had been corrupted, but they could get there, right? But in the West, most people had forgotten how to even read Greek. And so this is going to launch a whole new wave of intellectual pursuit. In order to understand and in order to do the textual criticism necessary of finding all these cool old documents, they're going to have to learn the languages. The best way to get back to the actual sources is to read them in their original languages. No longer was it going to be sufficient to read it in translation. And think of the intellectual spark that this is going to give off. All of a sudden, they're rummaging through everything and they're learning these ancient languages. And this is just blowing open their understanding of the world. But here's the bit. It's not just texts that they were now thinking about. They could see the ruins of the architecture and art of the ancient world as well. And this is going to be the thing that's going to dovetail nicely into these new emerging families who are flush with cash and power. Right? These families are filled with money, with capital, that they almost don't even know how to spend anymore. And that's going to trigger this thing we call the Renaissance, when we think about the Renaissance as mainly a artistic expression, a literary expression. Now these families who are flush with cash and power and a desire to cement their legacy forever, now they've got an avenue, right? The intellectuals and the economics are going to start to come together to create this thing. One of the earliest families who is going to wade into all of this is a family that has managed to really corner the market on banking in the city of Florence. And as soon as I write this name on the board, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I get it. The Medicis. The Medicis of Florence had come to power through a family banking business. They decided that the best thing to do is to skip the production of all the other things, get straight into banking. And they are going to become fabulously wealthy and enormously powerful because of that wealth. They will build a dynasty that lasts. Maybe the most powerful people in all of Europe. Yeah, including more powerful than kings and popes, although they'll have a couple of popes along the way from the Medici family. The Medicis will become patrons of the arts. And here's the interesting thing. Art and expression, both literary and drawing and architecture and all the rest, all you name it, that's always had people who wanted to express themselves in those forms, right? Art is one of the great consistent realities of the human story. No matter where we are, no matter what we do, no matter the times we're living through, we produce art and architecture and music. It's all there. Literature, poetry, you name it. We are a creative bunch. But as with everything, art costs money. It takes capital. To really get an explosion of artistic expression, you need just a lot of money. And that's what we get. The reason that there are so many artists during the Renaissance, right, is because the money was there first. Make no mistake, the Medicis and rival families who are trying to stamp their names on history to create a legacy, that's what draws the artists out of the woodwork. It's actually going to inspire a lot of people. Well, what do you know? Maybe I'll get into art. There's a lot of money involved. That's how you draw more people to the arts. You want more people in the arts? Fund them. Fund them massively so that every artist says, I can make a living on this. When you say to somebody, you can make a living on this, they will emerge. They will dedicate themselves to that new task, right? In America today, you know why people go into sports and entertainment? Because that's where the money is. If we paid school teachers, right, good money, you get really good candidates and wildly creative teachers. I mean, the ones we've got are really good, right? But it'd be amazing if we actually funded them. That's what happens during the Renaissance, right? That's what creates the Renaissance, is that the Medicis and other families like them are going to fund the arts as a way of expressing their wealth and their power. I mean, soon enough, the best way to essentially challenge the power of the Medicis, become rival patrons of the arts and architecture and all the rest. It starts an artistic arms race, which of course supercharges artistic production and innovation. I mean, two of the very basic things that we're going to get out of this is perspective in art and the use of oil paints, right? Two little things changes the world when it comes to artistic expression. But you see, it's not just the arts. I mean, that's the most visible, right? That's what we see, right? When we think of the Renaissance, we think of this and other things like it all over the place. It's amazing, right? But it's not the only thing that's happening at this time. This is going to spark innovation, not just in the arts and now the economy, obviously, which generated it, but also social structure, political theory, you name it. All of a sudden, people are going to be pouring new ideas into what is clearly a changing world. And this rapidly changing environment inspires innovation. We see it all across the board. And the ideas that had been percolating through the Middle Ages, political theorists like John of Salisbury or Anthony de Padua, people who had really been pushing the boundaries on political expression and political power and political structures, are going to be pushed even further because the environment was so different. They're pushing the envelope. They're moving. We get other scholars like Christine de Pizan and later Machiavelli. All of this created because of the environment of innovation that had emerged following the disastrous and catastrophic Black Plague. Which leads to the last thing that we need to talk about today. And I'm going to see if I can't write it underneath. Let's see. Yep, there we go. Our last ism of the day is humanism. One of the most basic features that we are going to see in the intellectual and artistic development of the Renaissance is what we call humanism. The goal of humanism is an understanding of the human experience through the lenses of that classical past in the service of human potential in the present. Let me say that again, because this is a decent working understanding and definition of humanism. The goal was an understanding of the human experience through the lenses of the classical past in the service of human potential in the present. It opens the door for new expression and new focus. You use the past as a springboard to express the present, and you use the pursuit of beauty and truth and the good and all the rest to create that better present. and you recognize something. You recognize that at the center of all of this is us, the human being. And so you start to embrace that notion of what it means to be human in the present tense, what we can do right now, what we can express right now. With all of this, we now have the opportunity to express that because of this material growth and this economic success. Even the church will adapt and adopt humanism, right? I spoke at the very beginning about the religious revival that follows on the heels of the Black Plague, that focus on the body and the focus on the now. Even the church is going to take this and use this as a focus to talk about what can the church do right now in the present tense. Yeah, we're still worried about your life everlasting. We're still worried about getting you into heaven, but we're also worried about now, right now. And it's a reclamation of the fact that human beings are created by God. We are given these bodies, which the Renaissance scholars are going to remind everybody are beautiful, right? The beauty of humanity, not just the ugliness of our corruption, but also what we can produce, what we can explore, what we can see and envision. All of that is true, not just outside of the church, but in. It's going to create moments of growth and innovation, and it's going to challenge systems that had been locked into place for centuries, or at least that was the perception. The Renaissance was a time of great change, both evolutionary and revolutionary. It adapted those developments from the medieval period and then supercharged this innovation through the dislocating effects of the Black Plague. It was a pandemic that led to a substantial reordering of society, and it prompted exceptional innovation and change. And it created a new awareness of every individual person and their relative value. The beginning of the European Renaissance is in many ways a continuation of things that had happened in the Middle Ages, but now, because of the dislocating and the devastating impact of the Black Plague, gave everybody a chance to move in new directions. It empowered the common people. It gave them the sense that some of the things that they'd used to have been able to do really existed. It created the system of capitalism, which then supercharges artistic and intellectual development because now, well, there was value in that too. There's a reason why we remember the names of the artists from the Renaissance almost more so than anybody else, right? Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, all the others. Even stretching out, because the Renaissance is still going by the time we get to the Elizabethan age. Shakespeare may be the last of the great Renaissance artists. We remember them because there was value to what they were doing, because they got paid, right? A society will spend money on the things that it values because they will see the long-lasting legacy of those things. This is the beginning of the European Renaissance. It will last for a couple hundred years at least. and it will lead us into the early modern period. It is a fascinating period of time. Let's not reduce it to one thing or another. It is large and fascinating and complex, and I've given you just the tiniest taste of it all. I'll have a whole series of questions this week for our conversations. I look forward to our discussion. I look forward to your reaction to this lecture. And I most especially look forward to next time when we continue to explore the early modern European world. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time.